Hey there. Welcome.
Thanks. Hi. Thank you for having me. I'm so honored to be here today.
I really wish we could have you in Tulsa in person. It would be a genuine pleasure.
I do too. I do too. I want to start before we start talking by trying something that I would usually try when we're in person, but this is the very first time trying it in a digital format. Number one, I want to honor the space that the University of Tulsa is on, and the people that lived in that space before and after we called this place America. And ask their permission to share this work in the space. Secondly, I want to remind all of us on the call that these times are particularly emotionally challenging, and the goals for these conversations are to try to enter a space of healing. But everything that goes through the transformation of healing sometimes hurts a little bit first, or is tender a little bit first. So I want to encourage each other to be open, to create community, even though we're using the electronic space, and to be willing to have an experience that will challenge us all to be a little different and in a better place.
That's terrific. I appreciate that. As I think I said to you, when we first invited you, of course, we're bringing you into a fraught and complicated moment in Tulsa's own history. This is the year of that we're entering the sort of centenary of the Tulsa Race Massacre. And so I think it's particularly important to have exactly the kind of conversations that you describe right now, both within this university committee and within the larger community in which we find ourselves embedded, both in the city of Tulsa and nationally.
Thank you.
Yeah. So would you like to begin by just saying a few words about this collection? I certainly have lots of questions that I'd like to ask you, but I would like to give you a chance to talk a little bit about the book and about your thoughts.
I think I want to start with a question, because I don't know where to begin in talking about the book. I want to start with a question. So please ask me a question.
All right.
Sean.
Well, I think, why don't I start with the fact that you and I were having this conversation yesterday while we were doing a tech check, which is that Kentucky and Oklahoma, where you teach at Kentucky and where we are, of course, sort of go back and forth for the dubious honor of incarcerating more women per capita than any other states in the United States. And this is not something to be proud of. It's clearly a failure of both of our states at the level of community, at the level of governance. Mm-hmm. So I wonder if we could use that sort of framing to think a little bit about one of the first definitions of bound that you talk about in the book. And I think the one that seems to be the most immediately evident on the cover illustration that you've chosen, which is the notion of Black women, especially in bondage. And maybe ask you to talk about one of the stories of Black women in bondage that you've used to shape the early portion of this collection. Maybe ask you to read some of the poems that reflect on those women's lives and struggles.
Sure. First, I want to talk about Oklahoma and Kentucky and the incarceration rates of women. So I'm framing this conversation in some ways about race, and that is true. But it's a larger conversation about ideas such as democracy, ideas such as capitalism and economics, and ideas about the way that the less desirable, whether poor, whether marginalized, whether infirmed mentally or physically, are disregarded, rounded up, housed, and stored. So it's important to talk about, I think it's over 80% of the women that are incarcerated make less than $20,000 a year and have an average of 2 children. It's important to talk about that. It's important to talk about the ways that I think 85% of these women in some ways are incarcerated for nonviolent offenses related to addiction, which I consider addiction and racism a public health crisis, right? And so And when I started to really look at incarceration, and this was like maybe 2008, 2009. And when I read statistics like the one that was presented by the Sentencing Project that said over the past decade, incarceration rates have risen for women over 700% and over 800% for Black women. I think when we talk about incarceration, it is another erasure of the ways that women are contributing not only to the economy, but to the labor force, considering that a lot of women that are incarcerated actually produce things at very discounted prices in a lot of major retailers. So there's opportunities to look at labor history and many intersections when we look at the prison industrial complex. Yeah, so that's the perspective that I'm coming from. I started this book off with ancestors, with my literary ancestors and birth ancestors, but I want to read a poem that Sean inspired me to think about. The second chapter of the book is taken from some historical reading that I did from a very profound historian, Dr. Callie Gross. And she has this wonderful book entitled Colored Amazons, where it looks at the issue of migration, Black women moving to Philadelphia, the city of love, and how because of impoverished conditions, many of them found themselves incarcerated. And so the second chapter in the book is a series of poems about some of the case studies that Callie Gross, this intersectional historian anthropologist, did. And one of the poems I want to read to you is Stewing. And it's about the conditions, again, the environment, the conditions of the prison that might create illness. So Stewing. I dream of hounds, their teeth loose in my veins. Their howls consume me. They howl and feast. She whispers not to run. I cannot refrain. Nightmares of this cell stirring in my brain. To survive, I suckle possum's teats. I dream of hounds, their teeth loose in my veins. Sweat pours from my body, a heavy rain. My intestine rotting, rising, my tongue reeks. She whispers not to run. I can't refrain. Tuberculosis fevers stew my pain, curdle my stomach biles. Vomit creeps. I dream of hounds, their teeth loose in my veins. Awake to my own barking, my voice strained. The nurse's compress grips me like a leash. She whispers not to run. I can't refrain. She tells me to hush as I try to explain. Stale air of this jail tangled in death's crease. I dream of hounds, their teeth loose in my veins. She whispers not to run. I can't refrain. One other poem from that series that I like to visit has to do with this idea of passing. So what it means to be in this biological mythology of race that has been created here in America. And this short series of poems is called Blackbird Medley. And it's actually about an inmate in the Eastern State Penitentiary that the warden actually encouraged her to live her life as white, and then she could go to an insane asylum. And so this is the kind of narrative behind that. Blackbird Medley 1. Blue veins vine my wrist, rosary stitch my palms. I pass through Eastern a yellow canary, my voice an ebony tongue, Hail Mary, no grace, black soul in the middle like Psalms. My mother's Bible songs, a broken heart balm, my lips carry her cello harmonies. Light skin can't hide what ears clearly see, a voice that gullies and steadies your qualms. White stains my skin and ripples in my hair, bears witness to a father I dare not love. Each strand a dusty crack cross Race Street, an eyelash threading a wish, a prayer layered in cobblestones to be white, drifting, each face it passes, refused to greet. Number 2, not a white woman, nor do I wither. In darkness I bruise a blue rose, blooming between brick I quiver. Not a white woman, nor do I wither. My song crawls, my voice slithers, frost-bit lips trail away my woes. Not a white woman, nor do I wither. In darkness I bruise a blue rose. Number 3, silence, no song. Beat me, bid quiet, gag me, dead. Number 4, something has died. There, silence, where a song once lived. Iron cuffed neck, wrist, no heaven, no one forgives. Persecute me. An ice water baptism wakes my soul for refusing. New boss man, first day on patrol. The warden, Cassidy, wants me to waltz wrong, turned right. Whispers, life is better if crazy and white. You solo dance the cracks between alabaster tile. You've lived in the black, you've gleamed white all the while. Number 4, blackbird, oriole, can do anything but sing alone. She needs sisters, black-winged melodies, the souled contraltos of dark angels. So, okay.
That's something else. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm struck by rendering that as a series of poems. I wonder if you might say something about why there are 4 of these blackbird poems threaded together in this way. I found that a really interesting structural form here.
Well, it was important to me to kind of talk about her life before the prison. So this particular inmate is from Cambridge, Maryland. And Cambridge, Maryland still has a street entitled Race Street. And it's so racially divided that blacks live on one side of the street and whites live on the other. Right. That's the history and not too distant history of Race Street in Cambridge, Maryland. But it's also important to know that that space in Maryland was one of the 3 places in the United States where the product was fancy girls during the antebellum economy. So a fancy girl is a multiracial or biracial woman that is bred to command a high purchase price in terms of chattel slavery, and usually sold into sexual private service or brothel style labor conditions. To give you an example of the lucrativeness of this type of production, male college students that were white were paid to sleep with enslaved Black women to possibly produce this type of woman. And if you had a really healthy adult male slave, he might be marketed at $1,200. A fancy girl at this time would be marketed closer to $5,000. And so there were actually places in America like New Orleans and South Carolina and the Eastern Shore of Maryland where this type of woman was cultivated and bred for someone else's profit.
And I think that points, I mean, and this may let me pivot to another set of poems, perhaps. One thing that really stood out to me in the Blackbird series that you read was again the sort of play that you're making on the word of on the concept of being bound. That on the one hand, she seems bound within this prison and the asylum to which they might send her, but there's a kind of more positive valence. I mean, no, sort of maybe a negative valence here also to sort of a sense of being bound to blackness as opposed to whiteness. But also, I think that other sense of being bounded to a community, right? This is a woman who's caught between different kinds of communities and offered this kind of unthinkable choice of living on either side of Race Street, as you describe it. So, and this gets to that. I think one of the things that really stands out about this collection is the way in which you take that concept of bound and remind us that it's so multivalent. I mean, every time as I was reading through this, I kept my, oh, of course, that's another meaning of this word. How can it hold such terrible meanings and such positive meanings at the same time? So maybe this is a moment where you could talk about some of the other sort of the ways in which you then pivot away from this notion of being bound, like physically held in captivity, to the notion of bondage also as a kind of being bound to a community. I think you used the term hemmed in actually in the collection, if I recall.
So bound in this collection, I've already hinted to there, of course, there are the negative connotations that we usually associate with bound, which is like fettered, incarcerated, oppressed, tied down, held in. But bound has a special significance to me as a multi-entendre, because like you said, it means like kinship, it means a sense of loyalty. In community, it might mean a community-based philosophy that's held in or hemmed in as a part of the weaving that makes your personhood. But it's also one of the strongest motivators for love, but it also means to spring forth and to abandon and to liberate. And so it was important when I talked about these women not to stereotype them or to caricature them into the space of oppression, but to also think about what the possibilities of liberation and desire were in their life.
I think that's really powerful, and it is actually a theme that's somewhat resonant, I believe, in Tulsa right now as we think about, as I said, the centenary of the race massacre. And one of the important narratives that tends to get lost as we think about the massacre and its aftermath is the idea that this somehow ended Black culture or Black identity or Black community in Tulsa. And in fact, Black Wall Street did manage to rebuild itself in important ways, not necessarily the way it did before, but that there was still a leaping out of those terrible conditions in that case. So I wonder if maybe you could read us some of the poems about that sort of notion of boundaries, that the leap. I mean, we actually have Harriet Tubman's biographer, I think, is joining us this evening. So the Harriet Tubman poem might be a particularly interesting one.
It would be. Context. And hi, biographer. I don't know who you are, but hi. Who you are on this call, but Harriet Tubman is holy. That's the title of the poem. And I want to say, a lot of people are very familiar with Harriet Tubman, but it was important to put this in the book because you have to remember Harriet Tubman was a criminal, and there wasn't necessarily an FBI most wanted list, but she was worth $40,000 in her time, dead or alive, which is worth like $1,100,000 at this time. And her crime was liberating thousands of people, right? So I wrote a poem, Harriet is Holy, and I'm gonna try to show it to you. Forgive my little ugly tabbed up book, but this is the final poem that made it to the book. And it's, I call it a triptych, but it's really, I think they call it a quadrupunzal, but it can be read in a variety of ways in any direction. And the poem is like this because I tried to write probably like 15 or 16 poems about Harriet Tubman, and they were all wrong. And they were wrong because I was putting them in historical context or geographical constructs in terms of latitude and longitude lines. But the whole gig with Harriet Tubman is that she couldn't be found. And so I had to create a poem to talk about her with that type of dexterity. And so that is that poem here. And so because this poem can be read multiple ways, I'm going to read it the standard way, left to right, but then I'm going to read it in a kind of, I guess, snake fashion from backward to front. So thank you for whoever's doing the historical work on Harriet Tubman. All right, Harriet is holy. Lick a thumb, hold hands to the wind. What is it about? Water, women. Take me, Miss Tubman, in tow. Her instructions, make my mark. X, a river be as faithful as daughter of Eve, mother of Cain. Her face, a rainbow wonder. Her smile, a collection of stars, of springs. Between water, between women, be no mysteries. I know of no man stands waist deep and wet in these crossings. Mossy riverbeds like braille fold in her feet. This woman needs these sweet waters in her palms. Thousands call her Moses. Ask the stars. Even Jesus needed a John the Baptist with arms wide. Her, she in the intersections. She be revolver, rescue. All right, so now I'm gonna try the sneaky way. I haven't done this in a long time, so let's see. All right. Harriet is holy. She be revolver rescue with arms wide. Ask the stars. Thousands this woman needs. Mossy riverbed stands between water, between women. Her smile, mother of Cain, a river bee. Her instructions make. What is it about? Hold hands to the wind. Take me, Miss Tubman, in tow. X, daughter of Eve, a rainbow wonder, of stars, of spring. I know of no man. These crossings fold in her feet, in her palms. Her Moses, a John the Baptist. She in the intersections. Her, even Jesus needed. Call these sweet waters like braille. Waist deep and wet in, be no mysteries. A collection, her face as faithful as my mark. Water, women, lick a thumb. So
That's extraordinary. Yeah, that's extraordinary. Yeah. I think rather than ask a question, I'm actually going to read a comment that was here in the chat from a colleague of mine in the English department, who's saying just how powerful he finds the formal flexibility of the poem. And he writes here, being able to read in different directions is very cool and gives the reader a kind of freedom, as it were, that it kind of unbounds the poem from the page in some significant ways. I wonder how does that kind of fit with the way that you understood this as you began to assemble this puzzle of Harriet Tubman?
Not exactly, but I'm really grateful to hear that comment. Thank you. It was just really important to me. I mean, I've read about it the entire time of not characterizing these women, right? And so the women that are not in the book are simply not in the book because the poems were not good enough for the women. I didn't choose women based on significance because I felt that every woman that contributed was significant. It was about my limitations as a poet. So I wanted this poem to be like Harriet Tubman, but I did not foresee the possibility of liberating the reader. So I'm really grateful to hear that. Thank you for that, because I like ideas of liberation a lot. Thanks.
Well, and your response there means I have to ask you this perhaps indelicate question, which is what's the one figure that you wished you'd gotten in here, and you're disappointed that you couldn't write the poem. You could never quite get to where you did with Harriet Tubman. You couldn't get the poem that she deserved.
Yeah, I'm just gonna say it, Angela Davis.
Yeah.
I have so much respect for her as an intellectual and as an activist and as a person. Her level of courage, her body of work, her commitment. I don't have the ability to capture that right now. I just don't.
I like right now. So this is a project that is.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, you know, maybe when I'm reborn, like 3 lifetimes from now, I'll be able to, right? But the depth and texture of her intellect, commitments to freedom, and activism alone, that would be like swimming underwater for an hour.
Yeah.
I don't know how I would capture that.
There's another interesting question here in the chat that I'll pose to you, because I don't want to lose track of it as we pivot to something else. And so it's Carrie Hansen who writes, was there an inspiration, perhaps another author, who inspired you to write in this particular way about Harriet Tubman, to use this particular form as a way of trying to capture the multiplicity of her life and her achievements, especially this idea of being able to read her in different directions, or read the poem in different directions?
There's lots of poets that inspire me, and I read lots of different poets, so I don't want to call anybody's name specifically because I may even get it wrong at this point. But I really try to make a commitment again to Miss Tubman and other people that are in this book, like my grandmother, to that these poems had to be double helixed. They had to talk about their lives, but also in some way, craft-wise, capture who they were. And if I couldn't do that, like double helix DNA, because I want to say, like, it's kind of beyond the parallelism because it's intertwined, right? And so if I couldn't capture that, then I'd have to leave it alone. And again, like, I threw away like 15 or 17 Harriet Tubman poems. Like, I just had to throw them out. And then weeks later, I was like, this is what it is. You know? And so, yeah.
And so it seems to me, especially to go back to our courage theme here, it seems to me that it takes a lot of courage to do what you've done. I mean, I think in the introduction you call these love letters to these women, and they're clearly, many of the women anyway, are people you hold an enormous amount of respect for. So I wonder if you can just tell us about to the degree that you can, about your creative process in wanting, and how you felt you could engage with someone like Ida B. Wells or Harriet Tubman, right? I mean, as you said, we didn't quite get Angela Davis here, but so many of these women are so powerful and so important. I wonder how you can talk about, is love letter the right metaphor you still feel like, or is it a conversation? How do you speak to them?
I think it's definitely a love letter, but for me, I want to say that this book is like 12 years in the making, and this is only 1/3 of a poetry manuscript that was a first manuscript 3 different times. Like, I just kept rewriting this book, and some of the poems, like I said, are at least 12 years old, and yeah, so sometimes you have to grow into the work. Nor did I ever in my wildest dreams expect to be the first American poet on Bloomsbury. I mean, if anybody that knows me can imagine this, but I know it's hard to imagine academic acting like this. But when my agent told me she was going to sell this book to Bloomsbury, I was like, this lady's absolutely crazy. I was like, Bloomsbury only makes fiction. What is she doing? Like, you know, I was like asking all these questions, but my my agent is from a different generation. She's about 80 years old, and I didn't fuss at her directly this time, but I do fuss at people all the time. But this time, I think when she told me she was doing that, and she like probably hung up on me because she's very much like me too. We fuss all the time. And then I called somebody else. I was like, this lady is crazy. She is talking about giving this book to Bloomsbury. Bloomsbury only makes fiction. I'm just gonna let her go through this because I have already told her what kind of presses might take it. And Bloomsbury took it. Right. And so we didn't expect the response that the book has had. 12 years ago, when I began thinking about incarceration and these things, right, and these levels of oppression, people were not necessarily talking as much about the prison industrial complex. So like, I wish I could say that I was that strategic and intellectual and visionary, but that's just not the truth. I think it's like, I once heard like Obama say in an interview, like some things are just serendipitous or they're organized outside of your purview. And so I think the response that the book has had was definitely outside of my conception and purview. Like, and even, you know, the publishers, like we couldn't imagine in our wildest dreams. We couldn't believe it. And then also that I can even publish a weird book like this. Like, you know, one of the things my agent and I talked about, she was like, look, you're Black, you're a woman, you live in the Midwest, and you're weird. Your writing is weird. People don't know who you are. You need to be in New York so people will know that you're normal and that you're a writer and that you're not this weirdo that's going to be like all marginalized. And I think in some ways that she's right. So like, you know, to have a book that's kind of like DJing in paper. I didn't expect anybody to publish me as I wanted to be published either. I thought they were going to change it.
Well, I mean, it's this may be a moment to talk a little bit about the book as a whole. And we've got a couple of process questions actually about your work as a writer here in the chat, and I'll come back to those in a moment. But it may be useful here to just step back for only a moment and for those who haven't seen the book yet, for them to understand exactly how you've put this together, which is a combination of these sort of portraits, brief historical portraits of significant women that have crafted stories for themselves in relationship to the various ways that you interpret bondage. And then your poems function as sort of love letters back to these stories. So I wonder if you could tell us a bit about that process. As you said, I mean, you accidentally or beyond your purview, however we want to think about it, fate or whatever, has enabled you to create a book that's entirely of its moment. I mean, it just feels urgent. Every word, every page feels like it belongs to both today and a minute from now. And yet it's a deep historical portrait of Black women's experience in the United States as well. So I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about the process that you went through in deciding to construct this book in this way, and how you think those portraits fit together with the love letters or the poems that you've assembled.
Okay, so the short answer is that I like hypersensory stimulation, and I like archives. I treat archives like a sandbox. My only I would say antagonism with history is how narrow and linear it could be, and that was one reason that I didn't become a historian, but actually gave into the writing, because it allowed for the complexity of what I think of as truth, where I feel like history did not allow that, right? So it's important to me to reclaim these archives and to recontextualize what we think we know as readers or as Americans about Black women. It was important to take these images out of the gaze, right? Out of a nationalist, imperialist kind of gaze, as Dr. Deb Willis at Tisch teaches us, chair of photography, and put them in context and conversation with the ways that I have come to know them, right? So there are actually archives in here in total, before the book was published, I paid about $1,500 for some of the collective images in the book. And that was like my money, because I refused to put images in the book of women in bondage. I refused to do it. So I didn't want to reinscribe this view. So it was important to me to reclaim the images. It was important to me to recontextualize the histories, again, not from this individualist perspective, but it was important to me to tell details like Ruby McCullum, one of the women in the book, her criminal case was covered in the newspaper by Zora Neale Hurston. Like, who wouldn't want that, right? And like how in tune to ideas that we talk about now, such as solidarity among cultural agents, was Zora Neale Hurston asked to say, this woman in Florida is being tried for murder. I gotta cover her case or they're not gonna tell her story, right? Correctly. And even when they stopped paying Zora Neale Hurston stopped publishing with the paper because Zora knew to be about her money, because they always try to give Black women 56 cents on the dollar, and some of us are not for it. And Zora was one of those people. And so she stopped writing for the Pittsburgh Courier because they wouldn't pay her. And then as soon as the criminal case was over, she sold a very close to non-fictional narrative to the Atlantic. I love it. I love it. I love it. I love Zora. I love it.
That's a great story. And in talking about archives, and I think there's a question in the chat that's a little bit touches on this. That's about sort of your the way you're talking about archives here and about history writing. The question here is history writing is a medium for telling these stories, or rather how history writing and teaching have been narrowed in certain kinds of ways. And maybe it would be interesting, I would just love to hear actually you sort of reflect on your work in relationship to, say, the 1619 Project, and another kind of major archival undertaking that I think is its own kind of love letter, although I nowhere near as artfully crafted, I suppose, as what you've constructed.
Yeah. I don't know how to talk about, because again, my work, it took a long time, and it was like this kind of maturing that I had to do for the work as well. But I think it's important that when we are trying to tell a complex human story, such as the crime against humanity that is chattel slavery, right? This existence of a form of selling human beings forever and ever for generations. It's important that we begin to recontextualize and retell these stories with a level of complexity and nuance that might have been missing from previous narratives, because everything in the United States is embedded through a type of hierarchical lens that privileges one type of intersectional identity, which is usually white and male. So in order to get the breadth, depth, and complexity of human understanding, we have to work outside of that. And I think one of our next challenges as scholars and creative people, which is going to be like really, really hard, is to learn to work outside of an imperial context or a nationhood context that creates a different type of hierarchy of knowledge.
Just one of your sort of definitions of bound, and I mean, as I understand it, right, we need to find new ways to bind ourselves to each other, and understand that as a positive and meaningful experience, to find these other kinds of affiliations that a certain kind of view has hidden or obscured or reduced to being unimportant.
Right.
And so with that, I wonder if we could maybe pivot to, I want to hear at least another poem here before we
Yeah.
turn it over to the general Q&A. We don't have much time left, and there are a million wonderful things here, but so maybe I'll ask you, which has been a chapter that's, a question that's come up in the chat a couple of times, is to read one of the poems that you find the most meaningful here, one of the love letters that you're proudest of or happiest with.
I definitely like Ida B. Wells. And I was thinking, because of proximity and geography, of reading the poem to Sandra Bland. So I'll let you choose, Sean. I usually ask the audience, but I don't know how it would get votes.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I don't know if I can speak for the whole audience, but let's do Sandra Bland. I think that would be an interesting way, just as you said, because of the proximity.
So Sandy speaks a choral refrain, and in the beginning of trying to write this book in this form, Sandra Bland was kind of like a Virgil. Like, she was kind of like a guide, a way of thinking about it. Being a younger person, looking at a legacy of resistance that's kind of housed in an American understanding of democracy, a place where Black women were kind of the first currency, right, of this capitalism, producing both with our hands and with our bodies. So Sandra speaks a choral refrain. It could have been me, with 3 degrees creased into the front seats, bits of the Constitution in my veins like Braille, the declarations tattooed inside my eyelids. How many times did Sally Hemings have to hear about them and affirm the tiny ego of Tom before he bears himself to his brothers, collecting their boastings, forgiving his debts? It could have been me. Like Sandy, I would have missed them dashes in the road, the ways I skirt around corners under the cover of sun, I fleeing an interview, happy to have some means, pockets fluffy with promises. It could have been me, listening to the gospel, the loads in my throat running a marble fog above my lips. My car would be all clouds of heaven, shaved with blue and red lights. It would have been me, my eyebrows high, my voice low, questioning Encenia about his bidding. It could have been me, a Black woman, the color of Oklahoma clay, a policeman pretending to be some cowboy. Sandy had been in Texas but a day. How long had he been hunting for one like her? Encenia seen this in his mind. It was a means of forgetting the woman that refused to love him and the Black man she clung to. In this vision, he is a rodeo-style hero. Sandy is a robe rascal. He holds out his tongue to the shower of coins and praises. A Black woman without a job owns her dignity. Did his fantasy desire that too? He minded out of her back with his knees. History told him that he could squeeze gold from a Black woman's wrist with iron cuffs. Is that why he braided the noose to resemble a lasso?
It's certainly a very powerful way, especially the framing of it as a choral poem, right? The many voices that are intersecting and maybe binding themselves together to both mourn and, I think, as I hear the poem, to help celebrate Bland's life. I think we have several questions here, and many notes from the audience saying how much they appreciated that reading. I should emphasize.
Thank you guys so much.
And one of the things that stood out to me about the closing sections of this poem is or of this collection is it becomes quite autobiographical in the end, as you talk about your own experiences, both of your son struggling with addiction, which I think was quite powerful, and of your own experiences as an Air Force veteran, and the complicated ways in which you find yourself bound to the United States, a country you served in uniform. I wonder if you want to just close at least our dialogue here before I turn to the more general Q&A about the ways in which your experiences, the ways in which you sort of pivot away from these love letters to using your dialogues with these historical figures to think about your own complicated intersections with what it means to be an American and the courage it takes to narrate that identity.
Again, this is a story that includes my agent and friend, Charlotte Sheedy. So we thought this book was finished. I don't know if we had already sold the book or if we were about to sell the book. We might have already sold the book. We thought the book was finished. And I wrote, these little set of poems. I think at that time it was like 6 poems about my personal experience and the complexity of me being someone who is at least a 3rd generation veteran. My father and my grandfather are war veterans. As someone who has served in the armed services, one of my best friends is a 9/11 survivor and veteran from the Pentagon. And so this idea of me being a patriot, and now that democracy is no longer counted in votes, but in violence in a very particular way in our contemporary moment, not that democracy has not always been violent, because it has, but in a very particular way that I didn't expect to see in my lifetime. Just the conflict of that. It's one thing to be a patriot, but being a patriot can never compare to my commitment as a mother. And so I wanted to talk about the type of, I would say, like mental and psychological conflict. Because to become a part of the military and to survive boot camp, which I almost got kicked out twice, it's important to say that. There has to be a certain kind of conversion that happens. You have to kind of buy in. Now, I wasn't somebody that was in boot camp or in the military saying, I love my country, or that type of person. But there's definitely some type of conversion that happens, right? And a part of that conversion is that you're doing this for your family and your loved ones that live in a specific geographic space that you are familiar with. So what does it mean for an organization that is paramilitary, right? That is not military, but may have access to the weapons and tools that we use in the military, which are designed to kill people. We do not make things in the military that are designed to keep people alive, by the way. What does that mean for those type of weapons to now to become a threat to the person I love most? And that's what I was writing about. And what does it mean for him, someone who is also invested in this idea of patriotism in many ways, right? I talk about in the beginning of the book that when my white ancestors arrived here in 1790, the African ancestors that they purchased and made families with were already here. So, to begin to think about that.
Yeah. I mean, it suggests again just how complicated this metaphor of being bound is to me, and the way that it then sort of rebinds you to each of the stories in these books. Because many of the stories, it's not just Sandra Bland you write about in the book, are dealing with the police, are dealing with either eluding the police, right? Being unfairly arrested or unjustly arrested by the police, escaping the police. Mm-hmm. That it seems that this metaphor doesn't ever stop spinning in the book, right? There's not like a progression from being bound to being free. It's that these metaphors just keep turning back on each other. And it leaves at least me at the end of the book in a kind of Hall of Mirrors sort of sense of that there ought to be a way out, but actually these metaphors just keep binding us to all of these complications, that there's not an easy solution.
There is not. And I think it's important. I was going to wait till somebody asked the question, but it's important to state, and then I'm going to stop talking, that like people like Harriet Tubman and Angela Davis and Assata Shakur at some point had to have a fundamentalist belief in freedom and ideas of democracy as Black women, or they would not be holding the United States accountable for those things. You have to believe in those principles in order to say, this is the social contract and I'm holding you accountable. You know?
Absolutely. And with that, and this connects to a question I just saw here. So I'm just scrolling back here. And I want to pivot here for the last couple of minutes of the conversation to make sure that we open a space here for people to ask questions for you as best we can in this admittedly slightly awkward format. So let me just jump up here real quick.
I'm not even going to open the chat because I'm more inclined than I am to talk. So I'll just be reading the whole time.
Sorry, I saw this one, and now that we have so many questions here, it's difficult to go back to them. But one of them had to do with the question here of intersections. Here we go. It's from Liza Williams. It says, do you feel the intersections within these women's identities, that they're never reducible to being a single thing, help them to understand the intersections of the challenges they face? And are the problems we face sometimes part of our identity as well?
I don't know if they're a part of our identity, but this is what I will say, that they so profoundly shape us that if they are not a part of our identity and they become a part of our personality, they definitely become a part of the identity of people that we influence. So I don't want to reduce it and just say children, right? But people that we influence. So I'm somebody who fiercely fights for probably and gets on everybody's nerves in my family. But I am an advocate for my niece being as brazen and quote unquote rude and bossy as possible. And whenever I see her, I give her the tools to control her cousins because she is the only girl. And I encourage that behavior in her. So maybe that will become part of her personality. I want her to grow up to be a leader, and I want her to be able to assert whatever she wants and needs for herself. So you got to cultivate that. You can't just, stomp it out with politeness and good behavior. So I'm the auntie that cultivates that, much to the annoyance, I guess, of her parents and others.
We had several comments here about good trouble in nearly every poem, I think, that you read, or references to it. And this sounds like another kind of good trouble for us
Definitely.
to be thinking about as well.
Money, cookies, whatever I can to control others.
So here's another question. This is Jasmine Johnson. She says, what advice would you give to African-American women navigating such bondage, visible and invisible, and our visceral experiences in the current climate?
One of my mentors gave me the advice that if a person doesn't know your worth, there is nothing you can do to prove it to them. I would encourage women to commit to their freedom and happiness, because that may be the reward that you can ensure. Other rewards are not guaranteed.
I wonder if does writing serve that purpose for you?
For me, it does. For me, it does. Oh my goodness. So I grew up in a family, and I say it in the book, but my family probably thought I was crazy when I was younger because I was hyper creative. And I was a talkative and precocious little girl that was really, really, I wanted like art lessons, music lessons. I wanted all of these things. And I didn't know at that time that my grandmother had been diagnosed with schizophrenia. My family believed that it skipped a generation. It would definitely show up in my generation. So they were looking for these things, right? And so their disappointment, and whenever I would want to be creative, was evidenced in their face and behavior. But also, as I got older, they would say things to me like, artists die poor. And then they would just give me an engineering book, artists die poor. And they would give me some other type of academic text. So by the time I became like 10 or 11, I began writing in secret, because pen and paper I always had. And I didn't have to recognize any disappointment on their faces, even as subtle as they thought it might be, with me asking for creative um, types of supplies. And then I was writing in secret until I was 28. This is still the most insecure point of my life, and also strangely the most comforting.
I mean, I find that a beautiful and astonishing narrative about the importance of the humanities, right, to any given moment, and how quickly we just seem to want to brush it away, when in fact, in the writing that you've done, both in secret and now very much in public, it seems to fit in very much with this question of, or this ideal of establishing a social contract, of being able to write yourself into identity, of being able to locate yourself in history and realize that you're not alone in the struggles, right? And that you have mentors that may be living, and mentors that you can find in Harriet Tubman, or the other, or Ida Wells, or Zora Neale Hurston, or the other figures that I think you excavate in this book. It speaks powerfully to a moment where it seems like everyone wants to question why we would need the humanities at all, when it seems the most fundamental thing we need to figure out.
Because we need to understand that, as I don't, it is convenient for others if we conform to the norms. It's never convenient for us. And Audre Lorde has some saying like, never stop somebody from creating, because you don't know what they're ultimately making. So yeah.
And in terms of making, as there was a question above, a librarian wrote about how inspired she was by the book, and that she wants to hear more about your research process for how you sort of found these women and explored them, because it sent her on a kind of sort of burrowing rabbit trail into various kinds of stories, as she wanted to go learn more about them. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that, the research experience for the book.
Number one, I've always been this kind of burrowing person, even before the internet was really popular. So like 25 years ago or so, when I was in college, and even before then, I used to love to be in like one of those older study rooms in a library. And I would just stay there all day. And I mean, it's not surfing when you don't have the internet, but just kind of burrow and dig. And again, treat these spaces like kind of like a free space and a sandbox, and, clay or Legos, and just look and look and look and look and look. And the smell of the books, the texture of the books, I'm into all of that. And so it's probably obsessive. I don't have a strategy. It's what happens. And it's less enjoyable over the net, because it's not as multi-sensory. It's only visual and text on the net. But when you're in a library, you get to smell. It's nice. I like a stinky book. I think you can tell a book by its smell.
Librarians are the great unsung heroes of every generation, I think.
They really are.
I have just a couple more questions, I think, in the chat that I'd like to get to here. And this one seems quite interesting here. This is from Casey Jones Matrona. It says, can you talk about or discuss the notion of how Black women fight against being bound in the academy? And she puts bound in quotation marks. She's thinking in particular about the recent example of Jessica Krug, this woman who claimed a sort of false Black identity and used it to speak for a whole shifting array of Blacknesses. So I mean, I can't say any more about that question, but that's what Casey's asked. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Casey, I want to first say that being a type of person that is invested in existentialism, find your desires and what's important to you, and then find community around that. People are complex. People are broken and hurt and bruised in so many ways that even those that we are sometimes in community and solidarity with, regardless of identity, may disappoint us, particularly when the norms of the academy and the ways that people come through the academy cultivates a kind of person and allegiances and loyalties that may work against who you think you are and who your values, what your values happen to be as a Black woman. So identify your priorities and then find community. James Baldwin says, for white people, education is indoctrination. For Black people, education is assimilation. And so I know the PhD was emotionally the hardest degree for me. I tell people it's like a bad marriage, like you got to stay whether you like it or not. Like, and so like you have to figure that out. I don't think it was easy for anybody to earn a PhD, but sometimes coupled with the emotional burden of loneliness, or that the methodologies that you're working within are counterproductive to the answers that you're seeking, is a different level or a different layer of burden that many Black women experience in the academy.
Okay, well, we've hit our mark, and I have a sense that that Zoom fatigue is a real thing. So I want to be cautious about about time. Usually when we're together, we run these things a little bit longer. But I want to just note for those of you who are joining us that again we are giving away copies of the book. And if you don't have a copy, I hope after hearing this talk you desperately want to get one. So please, if just make a comment, even if you just say I'm happy to be here or something like that in the chat, we'll then reach out to you by email in the coming week and send a copy of the book to you, Compliments of the Oklahoma Center for the Humanities. But if you're willing, DaMaris, I'd like to see if we could end by having you read one final poem for us as a way of sort of sending us off. I think that would be a really nice way to wrap up the evening here.
All right, I'll read a portion of Ida B. Wells because a lot of people.
Great.
Yeah.
It's my favorite. So I can give away. I kept fishing until I got what I wanted.
A lot of people, this poem took me like 4 days to get the first draft. Like 4 hard days. But a lot of people are interested in this poem because a good portion of it is written in mathematical rationalizations. And that's because even in the 1890s, Ida B. Wells was at the forefront of statistics and demography. And when we talk about her just as a journalist or an educator, we're reducing who she was as an intellectual. And when we don't talk about her anti-lynching campaign in context of her best friend whom found her husband, or whose husband was torn from her arms, and Ida B. Wells' solidarity and emotional tie to her best friend that resulted in the most profound anti-lynching campaign that this country has seen, we reduce who she is. So the speed of light is equivalent to love come in a hurry for Ida B. Wells Barnett II. Speed of light is equivalent to love come in a hurry. There are thieves in the temples. Circa 1892 equals 241 lynched, equals torn from their wives' arms, times rope plus a tree, and all of this multiplied by fire, times white supremacy and mob violence. 26 states proportionally united equal Alabama with at least 22 lynchings, and Arkansas with 25 or more lynchings. California tells us of 3, possibly more dead, and in Florida, there are 11 hanging from trees. In Georgia, there are 17 or more lynched that year, and in Idaho, there are 8 or more dead that year, and in Illinois, there is 1. In Kansas, not yet a state, they tell us of 3. In Kentucky, there are 9 or more lynched. And in Louisiana, there are 29 or more lynched that year. And in Maryland, there is 1. In Mississippi, they tell us that 16 people hang from trees, probably more. And in Missouri, there are 6 people lynched. In Montana, there are 4 or more people lynched. In the state of New York, there is at least 1 person lynched that year. In North Carolina, they tell us of 5. In Ohio, they say 3. In South Carolina, there is at least 5 lynched. And in Tennessee, home of the Ku Klux Klan, there are at least 28 bodies swinging from trees. In Texas, there are 15 or more. In Virginia, there are at least 7. In West Virginia, 5 people hang. In Wyoming, there are 9 or more dead. In the Arizona territory, they tell us 3. And in Oklahoma, the Durka Delta. This is the multiplied increase and the surge of lynching that year. The speed of light is almost equivalent as love come in a hurry. There are thieves in the temples, 160 Negro and 80 others, 5 of them women, 2 states over the Mason-Dixon, and 1 considered free. The square root of Black economic progress is the total diameter and whole of pure gold American racism and the demon possession of Francis Willard's good Christians. The speed of light is almost equivalent of love come in a hurry. There are thieves in the temple. A Black man hasting had the determination of any of the wise men girding through the desert night. Like a warning star, he is hoisted. A holiday ham is not equivalent to murdering a white man. Dog-eared like pages to remember his daughter, plus his son. And then this man, or more than lynched beside him. This man is decorated with bullet holes. This is the sum of them. Arms, fingers, nose, fracked from their faces like sphinxes, nothing left of their loins, no one to add to their legacy. The sum of Black economic progress equals lynching on Advent, Christmas Eve. The speed of light is almost equivalent as love come in a hurry. There are thieves in the temples. Circa 1892, there are 241 lynched. This means that they are torn from their wives' arms, times the rope, and then there's the tree, and all of this is set ablaze for white supremacy and mob violence. I'll stop there.
Well, it's a very powerful way to end the evening. And I know you said you don't have the chat open, but it's overflowing with gratitude for the evening that you've given us, the poems that you've shared with us this evening,
Thank
the
you
conversation.
so much for coming.
It's been a real pleasure. I do, as I said, every time I think I've spoken with you, we regret sincerely that we can't bring you in person to Tulsa, because it would be really powerful, I think, to connect you with some of the community here. But we'll hope that we can find an opportunity to do that again sometime in the future.
I would love to come. I would love to come. Thanks so much.
Of course. In the meantime, I want to invite all of you, even though, again, you're muted, but join us. You'll hear a silent thunder, I hope, coming from Oklahoma as we all say thank you and applaud you for a wonderful evening. We're very grateful, DaMaris. And I'm grateful to all of you who joined us this evening as well, and hope you'll come and join us for some of our other upcoming events at the Oklahoma Center for the Humanities. It's always a pleasure to welcome you as we explore the intersecting themes of rage and courage throughout the year. So thank you all. And again, thank you, DaMaris. It's a pleasure.